Well, thank you, Therese. And yeah, I do hope everyone can see my screen and me. You don't need to see me, by the way. Everything's going to be on the screen. I'm flattered to have been invited to give this talk, and thank you very much to Citizen. It's quite a bizarre one for me because I think this is simultaneously the largest talk I've ever given, with more than 200 of you watching, and at the same time it's just me talking to a computer screen. So I apologise if I appear to be looking in a different direction or leaning on the desk and not looking particularly interested. Normally I'd be stood up and animated and talking, looking directly at you. But as I said, it doesn't matter, just look at the screen and hopefully you'll enjoy this and find it quite interesting. A brief bit of introduction for myself. My name's Steve. I'm an archaeologist and a historian, and over the last 10 years or so I've done a number of archaeological projects for various locations and organisations that have looked in some way at D-Day, and particularly D-Day on the south coast of England and the embarkation from these shores to cross over the English Channel to France. And that's involved a number of structures on the south coast of England, and it's also involved looking at a number of landing craft. And I've researched numerous landing craft over the last couple of years, and at the moment I'm very lucky to be the archaeologist and historian for the restoration of landing craft tank 7074, which is the last surviving landing craft tank from D-Day, and is currently being restored by the National Museum of the Royal Navy and will hopefully open to the public later this year outside the D-Day story in Portsmouth. And all of this research into D-Day has given me quite an interest, as I said, into a particular aspect of D-Day, because I'm sure that when most of you think of D-Day, you have certain images that come to mind, be it the landings on the beaches, or perhaps the fighting inland that characterised the following 3-month campaign to break out of the Normandy beachhead. You may have images of some of the buildings and structures that are most associated with D-Day, such as Pegasus Bridge, the site of Operation Deadstick, and that brilliant overnight capture of the bridge just before the landings took place. Or you might think of some of those more concrete structures, the Atlantic Wall and defences that guarded the entire Atlantic coast from Norway down to Spain, which were supposed to be impenetrable, and which of course the Allies faced when they landed on the Normandy beaches. We do, of course, have structures of our own on the south coast of England that are relevant to the D-Day story as well. Places like Southwick House in Hampshire, which was Eisenhower's headquarters and where the very famous D-Day map is situated. This was the planning map for the naval forces for the passage across the English Channel to the landing beaches in Normandy. There are other facilities as well, such as the D-Day Wall on Hankley Common. This was a training wall that was built in Surrey so that troops, primarily Canadians, could practice assaulting these defended objectives that they would encounter in Normandy. And we also have bunkers of our own. This is Fort Henry in Studland. It's an observation bunker, and it was here that people were able to watch Exercise Smash, that rather unfortunate training incident in Studland Bay when several of the testing DD tanks sunk in the waters of the English Channel. But what I want to talk about today is a different aspect of D-Day, and that is the embarkation of troops from the south coast of England to get across to the other side, because it required an enormous amount of preparation and planning to make sure that this aspect of the operation could succeed. There were some 150,000 men and vehicles that needed to be loaded onto vessels to cross the English Channel in the opening 7 assault waves. And to maneuver all of those people down to their points of embarkation and get them onto their vessels to schedule was a massive logistical exercise. But it was one that was very, very successful. And that's because of the vast amount of preparation that went into embarkation sites and the road transport network in advance of D-Day. Now, some of these sites that were constructed for D-Day were very ephemeral. So this is an embarkation pier built alongside Southsea Pier in Portsmouth to allow more men to reach vessels just offshore. This hasn't left any physical legacy for us. It's a temporary structure using scaffolding, and after that was dismantled, there's no real archaeological evidence of it. Other sites of embarkation used existing facilities that were built long before D-Day, and the vast majority of those were docks, in particular places like Southampton docks, and here you can see men of the 50th Northumbrian Division embarking on their transports that will take them across the English Channel. But there were also specialist facilities that had been built between 1942 and 1944, almost exclusively for this massive operation. And these were the embarkation hards that were built for landing craft. They were purpose-built during the Second World War, brand new structures, many of which have left a very rich archaeological legacy today. Now, to understand what these structures were for, it's important to go back to 1940 and understand our position shortly after Dunkirk, which is just coming up to the 80th anniversary. Having retreated back to mainland Britain and having left Europe, it was obvious that we would at some stage need to return to mainland Europe in order to defeat Nazi Germany. But in order to do so, we would need amphibious forces on a greater scale than we had at that time. At the time, we only really had two types of landing craft. The landing craft assault that you can see here, capable of carrying approximately 30 men or a platoon of infantry. And the landing craft mechanized, which could carry double that many troops or a single armored vehicle. But as you'll see, both of these are quite small and not really capable of landing forces on an enemy-held beach in the sheer numbers that were going to be necessary for a proper amphibious invasion of Northwest Europe. And so in 1940, the Admiralty started designing and building brand new types of vessels, in particular the landing craft tank. This was a seagoing vessel that was capable of carrying several tanks. The Mark I was quickly followed by the Mark II, seen here, and then the Mark III, which could carry up to 10 tanks, and following that by the Mark IV. By the time of D-Day, the UK had built 1,155 landing craft tanks, and to those can be added another 1,988 that were built by the United States after they came into the war at the end of 1941. In total, there were 7,000 ships involved in Operation Neptune. 4,000 of those were landing craft, and 800 of those were these landing craft tanks. To that, we can also add even larger vessels. This is a landing ship tank. It's an ocean-going landing craft with 2 decks, and as you can see, bow doors, which makes it far more seaworthy. 1,000 of these were built primarily in the United States during the Second World War, and a further 236 of these were involved in Operation Neptune. But there is a problem with these types of vessels, and you can see it in this photograph, and that's how you get on and off it. And these officers up in Scotland may very well be looking at these landing craft and thinking, well, how on earth do we get on it? Because existing port facilities, docks and wharves aren't ideal for actually getting onto a landing craft because everything needs to go over that bow ramp. And that bow ramp is designed, of course, to be dropped on a shelving beach so that vehicles can drive straight off of it onto a beach and then up towards the inland area. Now, this creates a bit of a problem because most of our dock facilities, as I said, were wharves. There's only so much that you can do to control the environment where these landing craft will arrive when they make their amphibious assault. And Dieppe shows some of the dangers of landing in the wrong place, where shingle can cause vehicles to bog down. But you can, at the very least, control this sort of problem when it comes to embarking onto your landing craft. What you don't want is massive queues of traffic building up, waiting to get on a landing craft, but they can't because they're getting bogged down in a beach. So what was needed as a means of being able to dock and embark vehicles on landing craft was a purpose-built facility to accommodate their bow ramps. What was essentially needed was a concrete beach. And so in 1942, Combined Operations Headquarters issued orders for the construction of several embarkation hards. They required one in Poole Harbour, one in Lymington, and one in Leap in the New Forest, 4 at Gosport, 2 at Shoreham-on-Sea, and 2 at Newhaven. In total, this would have provided berths for 42 landing craft, but it was very quickly realised that that was far, far too little for the growing fleet of landing craft. And before construction had even started, the Admiralty and the Combined Operations Headquarters issued orders for a phenomenal building programme for these embarkation hards, including 5 down at Falmouth, 5 at Plymouth, 5 in the Torbay and Dartmouth region, 3 at Portland, 1 at Poole, 3 in the New Forest, 4 at Southampton, 6 at Gosport and Portsmouth Harbour, 2 at Shoreham-on-Sea, 3 at Newhaven, 2 at Hastings, another 4 at Hythe and Folkestone, 5 in Dover, and then round the corner in Deal, a further 4. On the Upnor area, on the Thames Estuary, a further 3. 6 at Tilbury, 2 on the River Blackwater, 4 over at the River Orwell and Felixstowe, and then over in Wales, another 3 at Swansea and Port Talbot, and 3 at Milford Haven. Added to this were another 3 up in Scotland, and in total, between 1942 and 1944, 77 separate embarkation hards were built, providing berths for 246 landing craft. Now, some of these were built in existing port and dock facilities to take advantage of that available infrastructure. And here in Southampton, for those of you who may know it, that's Town Quay and Royal Pier on the right and Mayflower Park just next to it. And in this little area, 3 of these brand new purpose-built embarkation hards were constructed. These, when we're able to take advantage of all of the existing road infrastructure and facilities that a major port provides. But some of the embarkation hards were built in quite rural locations, such as this hard, PH hard, on the Helford River. These were in quite quiet backwaters and estuaries where it was possible to build them far more secretly and to carry out training away from the prying eyes of the public. So how were these hards built? You can see in this photograph that they're quite simple structures. And really they were, because what they essentially consisted of, as I said earlier, was a concrete beach. And up above the high water mark, up on the top of the beach, you would have a concrete hard standing marked here in red. But they were actually very cleverly designed so that vehicles could drive onto this hard standing, and then they could maneuver and reverse themselves onto their landing craft. Because what you don't want is a situation where your vehicles have driven onto the landing craft and then need to reverse off when they come to an enemy-held beach. So this plan is actually of Leap Beach in the New Forest, and you can see this concrete apron still survives today at the top of the beach. It's covered in a bit of sand and shingle, but it's pretty much still there. But this picture also demonstrates a problem with the coast around Britain that everywhere experiences, and that is the tide. And twice a day, the tide will come in and flood the intertidal area, which makes it very hard to lay concrete in that zone. So the problem was, how can you harden that bit of the beach? And that was solved by this enterprising Royal Engineers officer, Lieutenant Colonel Vassall Steer Webster. And his solution was to create a prefabricated concrete mat, or a beach hardening mat, as he described it. Early models of this were designed to be relatively flexible so that they could be laid over the contours of a beach. But one of the problems that was quickly discovered with that design was that that would then adopt the contours of the beach and become quite an undulated surface. And so the design was enhanced. Vassall Steer Webster returned to the drawing board and designed a more rigid type of concrete mat, one that carried through it several wire hawsers or metal rods so that they could all be linked to one another in a continuous mat surface. Now, these were very easy to produce, being purely concrete and metal, and they could be produced in workshops up and down the country, a fairly unskilled process, and they were produced in tens of thousands. And then they were transported down to the embarkation hards where they could be laid in a continuous surface in the embarkation area. And you can see from this film footage quite how large they are, but also how hardy they are, and that they'll take quite a battering from even very heavy vehicles. And you also get an idea from this footage why they've acquired the nickname chocolate blocks, although I have to confess I still haven't worked out if that was a period nickname or one that's just been given to them a bit later on in the post-war period. So after you've laid all of your beach hardening mats, you'll then have a continuous surface of them in the intertidal zone, and you essentially have your concrete beach. The one extra element that you need to add to your embarkation hard is a pier so that the landing craft can come alongside and help them maneuver and stay straight against the beach so that they don't drift with the tide. These were usually very simple affairs made of timber. Primarily timber dolphins were erected going out into the water, and these were connected together with scaffolding. And so your finished embarkation hard looks very much like this, with a timber and scaffold pier, beach hardening mats in the intertidal area, and then at the top you can see there the concrete hard standing. And this one's quite interesting because it's been camouflaged. It's actually been deliberately painted to help blend it in with the surrounding landscape. And that was quite important because actually when you're building these masses of clean, shiny, nearly white concrete, they're very visible from the air. And so great steps were taken to disguise these sites so that German reconnaissance aircraft wouldn't spot dozens of brand new embarkation areas appearing along the south coast of England. One of the other problems with these rural sites was always going to be getting to them, because although existing docks like Southampton and Gosport had a pretty comprehensive road network behind them, once you get out into the rural countryside of Great Britain in the 1940s, most of the roads were pretty much basic, unimproved surfaces, macadam roads, such as this example near Winchester. Now, these sufficed very well in the 19th century with the amount of traffic that was passing over them. And they're very simple affairs, really. It's essentially a lot of gravel bound together with a sort of clay surface, as you can see in this pothole here. But if you're going to start using these roads for massive convoys that are traveling down to embarkation hubs, in particular tanks, then they won't be able to deal with that road surface. And so the War Office instigated a massive program of road improvements on the approaches to all of these embarkation huts, laying a brand new surface across the top of them of what was still quite new at the time, tar macadam, which was a brand new surface created in 1900 or so by a Welsh gentleman called Edgar Hooley, I think, when he accidentally mixed tar with a macadam surface and came to the realization that this was a very enduring and hard-wearing road material. So many roads across the south were improved with this tar macadam surface, which was laid between 3 and 6 inches deep on existing road surfaces. And some of the embarkation hards had quite an extensive road network behind them. This is Mount Edgecombe Country Park, just outside Plymouth, and this served 2 embarkation hards, PP1 on the right, and just down in the bottom right corner, you can't quite see it, PP2. And this required a brand new road network behind them, and you can see some of the new surfaces, 3 inches of tar macadam surfacing to be placed on the existing carriageway. And just above that, on the final approach to the embarkation hard, a brand new carriageway to be built of concrete. And these concrete roads were built extensively to connect the new embarkation hards to the existing road network. This example at Leap in the New Forest is a brand new road laid in concrete for almost a mile from Stone Farm, where it meets the road network, down to the beach at Leap. And all around Leap, which is quite a rural location even today, the road network needed improving, and the annotations on this improvement map require a new concrete carriageway to be built on the existing road network, and also here PPs to be provided where necessary at intervals of 200 yards. PPs are passing places so that vehicles coming one way that encounter a convoy can quickly pull off the road and get out of its way, or for broken down vehicles to be put into so that they don't block the road. And the War Office even issued instructions on exactly how these passing places should be designed and the full width that they should cover, up to 22 feet, to make sure that vehicles could get past one another. And in some of the quite countryside locations, especially in the West Country around places like Cornwall and Devon, vast numbers of these passing places had to be installed on the rural road network. This particular set of roads just on the east side of the River Thal serviced 2 embarkation hards, and each one of those red dots represents a new passing place that has to be installed on the existing road network. Some of these passing places needed to be quite large affairs, and here this lengthy passing place, this new lay-by, is marked in red. But it required quite a bit of changing to the surrounding landscape, because the cross-hatched areas that you can see in the grey stripes, those are people's houses, and they needed to be demolished so that a sufficiently wide passing place could be installed on this road in Cornwall, which led to Mount Edgecombe Country Park and its 2 embarkation hards. These improvements then were carried out across the road network in 1942 and 1943. And then as the planning for Operation Neptune really got underway in the spring of 1944, it was realized that there would need to be a massive overhaul of lots of other main roads in order to make sure that they could accommodate the convoys that would be traveling down to the embarkation points. And so all across the south, roads were widened or strengthened, mainly by civilian working parties under the direction of the War Office, who went out and widened roads. These men are digging up the verges of a road in Hampshire and clearing space so that concrete can be poured in it. And very soon, by the end of May 1944, roads all across the south had this improvement, this grey stripe down the side of the road that widened them anywhere between 3 and 6 foot. And this road network really was essential for D-Day because of the sheer number of troops that would be moving to the coast to embark on their vessels. This is just one of the administrative maps that was issued. This is for the Tor Bay area and shows all of the marshalling camps and the road routes that would be used by troops to reach their embarkation points. Each one of those red roads was closed to all traffic other than military. A one-way system was put in place, and all of these roads needed to be able to accommodate the mass amount of traffic that would be passing down them. Many of them then had to be improved in the months beforehand. But the important thing is that it worked. All of these troops were able to head down to their points of embarkation by vehicle or by foot and embark on all of these pre-prepared, pre-built embarkation points. It was a phenomenal undertaking, and a few minor problems aside, everyone was able to get onto their ships and depart from the south of England on the 5th of June almost perfectly to schedule. There were 72 separate points of embarkation on the south coast of England for D-Day, and these used existing wharfs and hards and ports and docks. But of those 72 points of embarkation, 39 were the pre-built embarkation hards constructed between 1942 and 1944. So 54% of the points of embarkation, and arguably the most important, were these wartime embarkation hards. As I said, most of the fleet was able to cross the English Channel almost perfectly to schedule, and most of the landings went largely to schedule as well. Problems only started to arise once men were on the beach, which is to be expected. And in this manner, the landing craft were able to deliver their cargoes and then retire back across the English Channel. But their job wasn't done, and the landing craft for the next 3 months would be involved in a constant shuttling service back and forth across the English Channel, taking men and material and troops to build up the beachhead in Normandy. And on their return journeys, they would bring back with them wounded and German prisoners of war. Here you can see POWs disembarking from landing ship Tank 165 at Hardway in Gosport, and in the background you can see Portsdown Hill, for those of you who know Portsmouth. This constant shuttling across the English Channel brought with it phenomenal risks, because the English Channel at this time was still a war zone. We hadn't secured the English Channel, and German forces, in particular miniature submarines and mines and torpedo boats, were able to attack from Cherbourg and Le Havre and further up the coast around Calais and Boulogne. And the landing craft came in for severe punishment on many of these journeys. This particular one has managed to limp back into Southampton after sustaining a torpedo hit, which has nearly shattered and severed its tank deck. Which gives you some idea of the ferocity of the fights that they were involved in on a nightly basis. Of course, the Admiralty had expected this. They knew that they would need to maintain their fleet of landing craft to maintain the Army's beachhead. And so they prepared numerous facilities to repair landing craft. They built very basic facilities, such as this gridiron, which a landing craft can float over at high tide, and then as the tide drops, it's deposited on these beams, and men can inspect the underneath of the hull. A more complicated arrangement was this bow-on hauling slip, where a landing craft can be hauled clear out of the water on a cradle that is pulled up along these concrete foundations. And in this manner, it was possible to pull a landing craft clear out of the water so it could be serviced and the underside of its hull could be inspected. These could only service one landing craft at a time, though, and larger facilities were required. So they also built these broadside repair slips, where landing craft could be hauled out side on, well above the high water mark, where men could then get right underneath the hull and repair damage that had been caused to them. And these particular landing craft, photographed on the 12th of June, were in fact all damaged on D-Day and were then being repaired so they could return to the shuttle service. And this worked because from the period 6th of June to the 31st of July, which is 55 days, just in Portsmouth Command alone, the Admiralty were able to repair 238 major landing craft. So that involves landing craft tank and landing ship tank as well. 238 over a period of 55 days. That's more than 4.5 landing craft being repaired each day. And because of this pre-preparedness, the construction of all of these embarkation hards and the repair facilities, the landing craft were able to keep up their constant shuttle service across the English Channel, taking men and supplies and vehicles to the Normandy beachhead. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, this report, again from the Portsmouth Command area, which includes the Solent, Portland and Newhaven, you only need to look at the column for landing craft tank, which is all of the sailings for D-Day up until July the 31st. And there were 3,591 individual departures just of landing craft tank in that 2-month period alone. A phenomenal amount of sailings. Of course, they weren't the only vessels making these sailings, and you'll see all of the various other types that are involved along there. And some of them, of course, are much larger than landing craft. And here we see vessels like the ocean-going merchant ships, the coasters, hospital ships, and tankers. Now, these vessels, as I said, are far larger than landing craft, and they're not capable of beaching, landing on the beaches and discharging their cargoes. They need ports. And in order to use these, we would need a port on the other side of the English Channel. But all of the planners for D-Day had realised that wasn't going to be very easily forthcoming. And so they had made the decision to take ports with them. And this is that very famous invention, Mulberry Harbour. And in fact, they didn't just take one, they took 2 ports with them to build off the American sector at Omaha Beach, Vierville-sur-Mer, and in the British sector at Arramanches-les-Bains, Mulberry B. These are actually to scale. Where I've marked those little red lines, that shows the full extent of the harbour wall. So you can see that these weren't small, trifling little ports. These were absolutely massive ports, which could require the sheer amount of shipping that was going to be coming across the English Channel. And here is Mulberry B at Arramanches, and again, you get an idea of the scale of it. And I realise it's quite difficult to understand exactly how Mulberry Harbour works. But actually, it's quite simple, and we can compare it to an English port, a much smaller port like Dover. And there's 2 essential elements to Dover. There's the harbour wall around the outside, the breakwater, that creates that area of sheltered water so that the ships can come in and then use the docking facility. In this case, the ferry terminal down in the bottom left, where the ships can safely come alongside in fairly calm water and disembark and then re-embark the passengers that are crossing the English Channel. Mulberry Harbour works in exactly the same way. At the centre, you have your piers, which lead out to the pier heads in deep water, deep enough for the ships to come alongside. And then around all of that, you have the breakwater, the harbour wall, which creates that area of sheltered water for the ships to use. And it really is the harbour wall that is perhaps the most recognisable aspect of Mulberry Harbour. These huge phoenix caissons, the breakwater, were made separately and then floated across the English Channel and sunk in place to create a prefabricated breakwater. In the main, these were built in dry docks. The dock was closed and construction began. Here you can see 2 phoenix caissons being built. They'll be completed to their full height, and then the dock will be opened, it'll flood, and they will be floated out. But there simply weren't enough dry docks available to construct the total number of these phoenix caissons that would be necessary. And so planners looked at ways in which they could be built at other locations. And they actually selected 4 locations in the Solent, at Leap Country Park in the New Forest, 2 sites at Gosport, Stokes Bay, and Hayling Island, over by Langston Harbour. And the plan here was to build more of these phoenix caissons actually on the waterfront. Giant scaffolding was erected and construction of these Phoenix caissons began up to half their height. Then they could be moved along this construction platform to these specially built launching slips, launched into the water, and then they would be towed around to places like Portsmouth or Southampton where they could be completed to their full height. This then was a gargantuan effort, and we'll come back to it a bit later, but there were other sites around the south coast, such as this place, Clob Copse, on the River Bewley, just south of Buckler's Heart. This was a oyster bed before the war, but it was taken over by the War Office. A cofferdam was built across its entrance, and it was improved to turn it into a construction site. And here they built dozens of these beetles. Again, these are concrete, but floating small little pontoons, if you like. And these were the essential elements that would transport the piers. Here you can see them in use, holding the roadways above the water. These were the important floating piers that led out to the pier heads inside Mulberry Harbour. And it is, in fact, Mulberry Harbour that leaves us pretty much our richest archaeological legacy of D-Day, because all across northwest Europe you will find archaeological remains associated with Mulberry Harbour. Now you might be looking at that and thinking, what on earth are all of those green dots inland in France and all of the brown dots up around the Netherlands? Well, in the Netherlands, that's easily explained. In 1953, there was a great storm in the North Sea that caused widespread flooding in Belgium and East Anglia in the Thames estuary, and also in the Netherlands, where several dikes were breached and there was widespread flooding and tremendous loss of life. As part of our assistance to the Dutch government, we supplied them with numerous spare Mulberry caissons left over after the war. And these were floated into positions in the breaches in the dikes and sunk so that the dike could then be rebuilt around it. And so today we have this interesting legacy of these Phoenix caissons from Mulberry Harbour encased in earth along the Dutch coast in Zeeland province. And these four have actually been turned into a museum, the Watersnood Museum in Urkerk. And you can go in at the bottom end, bottom left corner, and you walk through all four caissons and come out the other side. And if you're ever in Zeeland province, it is a fantastic opportunity to actually see inside a Mulberry Harbour. And most of the museum is dedicated to the floods of 1953 and the Dutch water schemes, but also a large exhibit is dedicated to Mulberry Harbour itself. So it's a fantastic way to actually get up close to these relics of D-Day. And all of those green dots inland in France, well, as the German army retreated, they blew up a lot of bridges and we needed to rebuild them. And initially they were rebuilt using Bailey bridges built for the British Army. But as they then moved the Bailey bridges further on to continue to advance, as a more permanent means of fixing these bridges, they then used leftover bits of Mulberry Harbour. And this is one of the Whale roadways, which is still in use as a public road bridge in France today. Now, on the south coast of England, we do have a lot of archaeological legacy of Mulberry of our own. This is one of the Phoenix caissons in Langstone Harbour. This one never made it to Normandy. It developed a fault during its construction, and so it was towed into Langstone Harbour and beached so that it wouldn't interfere with shipping. And since then, it started to degrade even further. But at other places, we find them in more surprising locations. In Southampton, at the Red Funnel ferry terminal that crosses the Solent to the Isle of Wight, there's actually two pieces of Mulberry Harbour, a Whale roadway, which you should recognise from the bridge I just showed you, and beneath it a buffer pontoon, which is again part of Mulberry Harbour, specially constructed so that landing craft could come alongside it. Now these don't look in the best condition, that's fair, but actually they look pretty well technically sound. They're just covered in a lot of marine life. And happily, just 2 years ago, these were actually given protected status as listed buildings. So any future development of this area of the port will have to take that into account. Just across the Southampton water from those remains, there's more Mulberry as well. This is Dibden Bay in Southampton water, and just after the war there was a large amount of land reclamation here, and essentially a cofferdam was built up and the land was infilled behind it, that big green field you can see. And in order to create that cofferdam they essentially used more leftover pieces of Mulberry Harbour. And if you look there you can see the dam that was built is actually constructed of dozens of the concrete beetles that were spare in Southampton at the time. And there's at least 36 of them lined up along the coast there. We also have archaeological remains of the construction sites as well. So further down the Solent at Langstone Harbour, where they built 4 of the Phoenix caissons on the waterfront, you can see on the left of this photo, behind the scaffolding, keel blocks. Where the surface upon which they built the caissons. They were then towed down this construction site to the nearest bit to the water where these specially built slips were constructed. These are the concrete foundations, and metal rails on them will have allowed the semi-complete Phoenix caissons to be slid into the water. And this is in fact a launch taking place at Hayling Island into Langstone Harbour in 1944. Shortly after D-Day then, this site fell out of use, it was no longer needed, and after the war it was photographed, and you can see the line of the construction site on the waterfront there with the 4 separate sections of those keel blocks projecting up from the ground. Now that site has changed quite considerably today, and you'll see that there's now a car park there. But more recently, the Citizen team have visited, and you can see that there is actually still an awful lot of concrete on the ground. And one of the caisson construction sites is visible there, just in front of the ferry pub. And in fact, when they surveyed the car park, they realised that those keel blocks have simply been filled in between them, and so they still project up to the road surface. And now those keel blocks essentially act as car parking bays. So there's an awful lot of archaeology buried underneath backfilling at places like that. At other sites like Leap, where 6 of the Phoenix caissons were constructed, more of the construction site is visible. Here we have a flat concrete platform between 2 transporting walls. This is one of the construction sites. And here you can see some of the walls along which, using a rail system, the caissons were slid, pulled by steam engines to the launching slips that lead down into the deep water. Again, these are just the foundations. There would have been a metal rail network which would have allowed the caisson to slide into the water. But there is another facility at Leap, of course, the embarkation hub that was built in 1942. And in the intertidal area, you will see remnants of this, in particular, the famous chocolate blocks. And just out beyond them in the water, 2 dolphins that made up one of the mooring piers. Now, it's very heartening to see these here, but if you'll pardon the pun, unfortunately, they are very much on their last legs. They were built of metal, and that is slowly eroding. And every winter I expect them to go, and every winter so far they've surprised me. But it can't be long now, because they are approaching 80 years old. But that would be a shame, because as far as I've been able to ascertain, these are the last surviving dolphins from one of the 77 embarkation hards that still survives today. Because after the war, a great many of these embarkation hards were either removed completely or deliberately broken up to some extent that they leave only archaeological remains. This is S4 hard in Southampton on the River Itchen. And it was used by troops of Force J going to Juno Beach, the Canadians, and Force G, the 50th Northumbrian Division, who were bound for Gold Beach. And here you can see the troops embarking on their landing craft on, I think, D-3. So I think this would have been the 2nd of June, because of course they were embarking to a timetable meant for the 5th of June. And you can see inland to Southampton there, the areas of Northam and the gas terminals, sorry, the gas towers. And on the left, you can see the pier, which was much more substantial at S4. It appears to have been made of concrete. And there, in fact, you can see the name of the hard on the board for shipping approaching it as well. After the war, those concrete piers, the dolphins rather, were still there, although the scaffold pier between them had been removed. And then on the or in the centre of the picture rather, you can see the concrete hard standing, and to the right, the concrete road that led to it. But that area of Southampton has changed quite considerably, and that pier, which was on the waterfront, has now completely been built over. And there is literally nothing left of that embarkation harbour today. And I often wonder how many people who visit St Mary's Stadium realise how close they are to a genuine point of embarkation for D-Day. And in fact, all 4 of the embarkation hards built in Southampton have been almost completely removed. This is the only remaining bit of infrastructure from those 4 hards that still survives in Mayflower Park. Ooh, that skipped. But many of the embarkation hards do survive in reasonable condition, and they leave us a very tangible archaeological remain. This is one of the embarkation hards at New Haven, and you can see the hard standing on the beach down in the bottom left, and leading to it this concrete approach road, and up in the top right there's even one of the passing places built into it. So this is all original 1940s construction. At Gosport at Stokes Bay, 4 of these embarkation hards were built, and they were used primarily by Force S and Force J, going to Sword and Juno beaches respectively. And this genuine colour footage shot by the Canadians shows troops of their first wave embarking on their landing craft at G1 hard, the westernmost of the 4 hards. These then are Hobart's Funnies, or Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, embarking on their landing craft. These were due to be the first vehicles to land on Juno Beach on the 6th of June. This chart shows just 2 of those embarkation hards, an Admiralty chart. It shows G1 hard on the left and G2 hard on the right, and the massive infrastructure that was built around them to service them: water tanks, air raid shelters, hardmasters' offices, stores, workshops, and then behind them requisition houses that were used for accommodation. That area, though, has changed quite a bit today, and you'll be forgiven for thinking that it hasn't left much of a trace. But if you look closely, you'll see that there's 2 public car parks on that beach road, Alva Bank West and Alva Bank East car parks. And if you look more closely at that Admiralty chart, you'll realise that in fact those car parks are built on the concrete hard standing of embarkation hards G1 and G2. And in fact, if you park there and walk round onto the beach and look back, you get this lovely archaeological section of that concrete, because all that's happened is the surface has been tarmacked, but the remains of the concrete hard standing are still there today. And if you walk down into the intertidal area in front of this car park, you'll come across hundreds of these beach hardening mats. And if you're very lucky, you'll find my wife there as well. And in fact, all along Gosport Stokes Bay, you will find concrete associated with these embarkation hards and the Mulberry Harbour construction sites. These aren't just pieces of industrial waste that have been left on the beach. They are relics of this massive D-Day preparation that took place along that section of waterfront. Just up inside Portsmouth Harbour, you'll find other remains associated with D-Day as well. And people who journey into Portsmouth Harbour and back out again on the M275 probably quite frequently wonder what these interesting looking structures are on their left as they leave Portsmouth in the evening. This apparent series of long metal slips leading into the water. And in fact, they are the very visible remains of one of those repair facilities. And in fact, it is this very repair facility that I showed you earlier. In the background, you can see Portsdown Hill, and on the top of it, above the central landing craft, Fort Widley, one of the Palmerston forts built in the 19th century. And as I said, these landing craft, certainly the ones on the left and right, were both at Sword Beach. They both sustained damage, which is recorded in the after-action reports. And here on the 12th of June, they're receiving repair so that they can then return to the shuttle service. And these repair facilities pop up all along the south coast. This is the Tamar Bridge, just across the Tamar from Plymouth. And you can see in the foreground more of those repair slips that were used to haul landing craft out and service them. And even in quite quiet rural places like Salcombe in Devon, a very nice rural Devon location. There's that nice little triangular looking beach just on the east side of the estuary there. But if you go down into that beach at low tide, you'll find this huge, great expanse of concrete. And in fact, that piece of concrete is this very repair slip, the one that I showed you earlier, which was used for hauling landing craft out of the water so that they could be serviced. And once you get your eye in, you can start to see these facilities all along the south coast. This is Crosshouse Wharf in Southampton, and it doesn't look like much now. It looks like a fairly modern, a fairly beat up slip for the local sailing club or rowing club. But in fact, you can trace that again back to 1943 when it was constructed in advance of D-Day. So that is just next to the Itchen Bridge in Southampton, and Southampton has other surprises as well. If you go a little bit further north to Southampton Common, you'll find some very interesting traces. In particular, up in the northwest corner where the common meets Hill Lane, running down the left side of the common there is a concrete pathway that leads onto the common from Hill Lane. And again, we can trace that back to the Second World War and 1943, because it appears on this work schedule that was issued by the War Office, marked in red there. And you can see that it's part of a report with a new road that is referred to in the attached document. And that new road is still there, nearly 80 years later, serving today for dog walkers and cyclists to access the common. It was actually built in 1943 to allow access for vehicles and armoured vehicles onto Southampton Common, where there were 4 marshalling camps for troops gathering in advance of D-Day. At Mount Edgecombe Country Park near Plymouth, where all of these roads were improved or built to support the 2 embarkation hard, you can see that the vast majority of them still survive today. Most of them with their concrete still exposed. They haven't even been resurfaced. And this road network down near Falmouth that I showed you earlier, with all of those red dots indicating passing places, well, you don't have to go very far along those roads to find those same passing places exactly where the map tells us they should be. So this isn't just a regular lay-by on the side of the road. This is perhaps a new class of monument that we could give it a title for, a D-Day lay-by. And this much larger passing place that required the demolition of 3 homes. Well, you can see today why that was necessary, because the original width of the road is demonstrated by that blue vehicle heading up. And in order to widen it so that there was sufficient space for convoys to pass one another, they had to demolish these 3 houses, which has left the road in its present width today. And is all thanks to the preparation for D-Day. You can see, in fact, that somebody's now built a new house to replace the 3 that were demolished right where this camera is positioned. And these marshalling maps or administrative maps that show all of the convoy routes into the embarkation areas are very useful clues that help us identify the location where these improvements were carried out. In the New Forest, for instance, back in the Second World War, before the Marchwood bypass was built, it was this road marked in red, Hive Lane, which turns into Jacob's Gutter Lane, which is the main road north out of the forest to Totton and then on to Southampton Docks. This road then needed to be capable of sustaining large numbers of vehicles and armoured vehicles making their way from their marshalling camps to the docks. And when you look at aerial photographs from the period, you can start to see along either side of the road those telltale light grey or white stripes that indicate road widening has taken place and brand new concrete has been poured there. And it's using clues like this that we can start to identify the locations of bits of footage, such as this clip I showed you earlier. And if you watch the chimney in the background up at the top of that picture, you can see that actually it's possible to match its location to present day Jacob's Gutter Lane in Totton. This location was a bit easier to work out because that's a pony wandering around in the background. And in fact, this location hasn't changed much today. Those 2 cottages are still there, and that road is still the same width that it was made in 1944. I always think it's quite interesting when I drive along this road to think that the only reason two vehicles can pass one another on it today is that it was widened sufficiently for tanks to be able to pass one another in 1944. Places like Leap, where all of these road improvements were shown, the new concrete carriageway and the passing places, well, that new concrete carriageway is still there underneath the tarmac that has been laid on the public road since. And so you can see that concrete in section here after rainwater has washed the sand away. All that's happened is that a new tarmac surface has been placed on top of the concrete road. So that is the original 1940s Second World War road beneath it. And just to the north of Leap, on the approach road to the embarkation areas, you can see examples of these concrete passing places, many of which haven't even been resurfaced, and the original Second World War concrete is still exposed. But places like this are under threat, and in fact they always have been since the Second World War itself. In particular, the embarkation hards on the coast are at risk from coastal change. Here at Hive in 1943, a large storm has swept shingle and gravel and sand right across the embarkation hard. It is essentially buried underneath all of that gravel and is being cleared by a bulldozer. And very much the same thing is happening in the modern day. This is the construction site at Hayling Island that I showed you earlier. And this photograph taken in 1999, you can see the launching slips, those long black lines coming up from the beach by the car park. But if we fast forward from 1999 to 2015, you can see how that sandbank, that spit, is growing over and covering those launching slipways. And in fact, when Citizen visited this site last year, that is pretty much all that there was to be seen of the slips. And so coastal change is covering this site. In one sense, it's good because it's protecting it, but it's also hiding that archaeology from us. The other type of coastal change that these sites are at risk from, of course, is the very opposite, a more destructive process, in particular undermining. This is Hastings in 1943, and another storm has swept away a lot of the gravel from underneath the concrete apron and has caused its own weight to make it collapse. And so that site was not used for D-Day. And we see much the same thing happening at sites along the coast today. This is the Mulberry Harbour construction site at Leap, and undermining is starting to clean out underneath that concrete construction platform, and soon its own weight will cause it to collapse. And at Leap, this has always been a risk, and in fact, in the 1990s, a large part of the construction site was deliberately demolished to create these coastal defences to try and break up wave action and reduce its impact on the rest of the site. And in fact, it's been very successful because by and large, most of the site has sustained very well for the past 20 to 30 years since this happened. The other process that these sites are at risk from, though, is man-made, and it is development, because our coast is ever-changing as we build and expand along it. And examples like this can again be seen within the last couple of years, even, all along the coast. So Portland, on the north side of Portland, the area of Castletown, there were 3 embarkation hards built for D-Day. One of them built on Castletown Quay. And in blue, you can see the areas that were to be constructed out of concrete and surfaced and hardened so that vehicles could pass down them. Now that concrete survived for a very long time. This photograph was taken in 2016, and you can see that concrete approach road is still leading out to the end of the quay. But unfortunately, in 2017, that area was then resurfaced. Now, I'm not saying that this shouldn't happen. These are continually developing sites, but we should try and identify locations like this so we can at least record them before they are removed or covered over. Now, it might be that that was just re-tarmacked, and that has happened all along the south coast, and you can often see the evidence of that if you know how to look at it. This is Lulworth Avenue in Poole, built to support one of the embarkation hards at Hamworthy. this road was given a brand new concrete surface. It was rebuilt in concrete. Since then, it's been tarmacked, but you can see the telltale evidence of the concrete underneath that road, where the cracks in the tarmac have split along the sections of individual concrete that were laid. So in all likelihood, the original World War II concrete road survives pretty well preserved underneath that tarmac surface. In other instances, we're not always so lucky. Over at Marchwood on the New Forest coast, I was quite excited late last year when I discovered that 2 of the bow-on repair slips for landing craft had been constructed here at Cracknell Hard. And when I looked at Google Maps and I saw this image, I realized that they were still there and intact. Those look to be the original slips and cradles that would have been used back in 1943 and 1944. But unfortunately, what I didn't realize was that Google Maps was using imagery from 2016. And when I looked at 2018 imagery, unfortunately, that site has been cleared. So it only came to my attention last year, too late, unfortunately, to get it added to the local historic environment record so that sites like that can be recorded before development takes place. Fortunately, there are organisations that are recording sites like this. The Citizen Project is one of them, and their remit is to investigate and record sites in the intertidal area that are at risk from development or coastal change. And they have been working for a number of years on some of these facilities. And this photograph from about 4 years ago, taken at LEAP, shows Citizen and National Park Authority volunteers working to record the construction site for Mulberry Harbour. And this work has enabled groups like Citizen and the National Park Authority to create quite detailed archaeological records of these sites. And that's quite important because although we know an awful lot about Mulberry Harbour and the phoenixes that were constructed here, we know very little about the construction site itself. At places like LEAP, we have no photographs, and we definitely have no plans of exactly how this site was constructed. So the archaeological record is the only record we have of these sorts of sites. But by getting detailed information, it's possible to turn this into a far more comprehensible visualization of how that site might have looked in 1944. And this 3D model was produced by Wessex Archaeology for the New Forest National Park Authority just last year. And you can go online and find this. Just Google LEAP D-Day 3D model and you'll find this. It's an absolute fantastic piece of work and demonstrates how this site might have looked in April, May 1944. And that is largely built in its physical appearance from the archaeological record rather than documentary evidence, because we are lacking in that area. Of course, there are other ways to recreate these sites, and with the lockdown, one of the things that Citizen has been doing is finding other ways to depict embarkation hards, and I'm particularly pleased with this one and its use of chocolate blocks. But we can do more than just archaeologically record these sites. We can go on to research them in more detail as well. And places like Mulberry Harbour can genuinely benefit from further study. All of the Phoenix caissons that were built had their own diary, if you like, which recorded exactly what happened to them over the course of their construction and their deployment on the other side of the English Channel. And it's full of information about how well they performed, their structural integrity, and so forth. And if we take all of this historical evidence that we can acquire and we apply it to a bit of Mulberry Harbour, just the western breakwater of Mulberry Bee, we can start to study this bit of the harbour in far more detail. We can look at all of the individual Phoenix caissons that make up that breakwater wall, and using the historical evidence that we have, we can assign them their original identities, because they were all given code numbers so that their performance could be recorded. And then, after the Second World War, we can watch the change of that area of the breakwater and follow the movement of those individual caissons. And then into the modern day, we can still assign identities to some of them. Now, you see there's far less here now, but you can, just underwater, see the shadows of some of the sunken Mulberry sections. Fortunately, in 2012, the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office did a survey across Mulberry Bee, and they were able to record most of these sunken sections as well. And that means that we can now look anew at this view from the modern day, and again, we can identify all of those individual caissons. Now, the benefit of this is that we can stand on the cliffs overlooking Archaeology, and we can look at the western breakwater as it is today, and we can understand more about those individual caissons. We can identify exactly which ones they are and where they were built. We can learn why some of them may have failed more compared to others. Is it possible, for instance, that the ones that were built on the beach, Stone Point at Leap and Stokes Bay at Gosport, have corroded more because the quality wasn't as good as those that were produced in dry docks, such as those in the background at Southwest India Dock, Russia Dock, which would have benefited from less salt air, which may have affected the setting of the concrete. So we can assign identities to all of these individual bits of Mulberry Harbour, and we can remind ourselves that this is built heritage of those places that just happens to have travelled across the English Channel to Archaeology in France. And it's not just concrete that we can do this for. We can also do it for the people involved at D-Day as well. This is another one of Hobart's funnies. This is a Sherman crab flail tank of the Westminster Dragoons. And the flail at the front of the tank is designed to spin very fast, and it will detonate mines in the tank's path. This was knocked out on D-Day as it travelled along Gold Beach, and then was photographed here on the 7th of June. And we can learn an awful lot from this picture about this specific tank, because over on the left, you can see its identification plate, and that carries all sorts of useful numbers on it. At the top, 29964 is its unit identity. That tells us it's the Westminster Dragoons. There's a little triangular symbol you can see just behind that red circle. That's the formation sign of the 79th Armoured Division. But the thing that red circle is circling is that the chalk number very faintly put onto there, which says 2026. That's its landing table index number, a nefarious code number that was applied to all vehicles and troops and vessels involved in D-Day as a means of pairing the correct units, army units, with the correct naval units, so that they would all get on the right landing craft and land on the D-Day beaches in the right order. Now, I won't lie, this makes studying D-Day and working out which vessel is which incredibly difficult, but they are a very useful means of identifying more about landing craft and tanks if you can decipher them. And in this case, we can look at the embarkation orders for Gold Beach, Force G, and we can see that same landing table index number just there, 2026. And this tells us that it embarked at Q2 hard, which is the code name for the hard that leaped, as I showed you earlier. Gives us all sorts of useful information. This unit embarked on its landing craft at 5 in the morning on D-2. Now, bearing in mind the 24-hour delay for D-Day, this would have actually been the 3rd of June, which means that they spent an extra water bobbing up and down in the Solent before they sailed on the 5th of June. And so we can identify these units and exactly where they embarked from, so we can connect them to places in the UK rather than just the location of that photograph in France. And in fact, we can go back through the war diary for that unit, and using that information and the information from these maps, which show us the convoy routes that they would have taken, we can then work out the unit's route from its marshalling camp in the New Forest down to its point of embarkation in Leap Country Park. And then looking at all of the road infrastructure that was built and going out and looking to see what survives, we can identify all of the archaeological remains along that route as well. And this is essentially what archaeology is. It's all about finding the evidence for the past. And here we're looking for evidence from 1944, the evidence of these journeys that these troops and vehicles took across the south of England on their way to their points of embarkation. And in doing so, these random bits of concrete that seem to litter the south coast with no obvious purpose, they become part of a wider narrative. We can tie them to specific units and events and a journey that culminates in France in June 1944. And the reason I think this is important, and the reason I study sites like this, is because last year we commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and next week we commemorate the 80th anniversary of Dunkirk. And unfortunately, like it or not, we are going to start losing our living links with the events of the Second World War over the coming decade. We won't have veterans that we can commemorate anymore. All we will have are events and memories. But we also have these sites, and these bits of concrete, some of which are in France, but not all of them. We can find these sites along the south coast of England as well. In a few cases, some of these embarkation hards have become sites of memorials, but they are in the minority. And I think it's really worth studying and understanding these individual locations in better detail, so that when future generations come to study D-Day, they have tangible evidence of D-Day in their surrounding area on the south coast of England. Sites like these on our beaches and in our coastal towns have their own special legacy that I think is worth remembering. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I think I've used my full hour there. If this phenomenal interest in concrete is something that interests you, then you can always follow me on Twitter at Sea Spitfires, where I talk about coastal forces and motor torpedo boats and lots of concrete. I've just started a new Facebook page, which you can follow. So there's not much on it at the moment, but at Embarking the D-Day Armada, which is where I plan to start cataloguing sites like these that I've shown you already. And if you want to find out more about the Citizen project, and I'm sure they hope to be back out on the coast soon, and when they are, they'll be looking for volunteers, no doubt, as well. You can find out all about the work that they're doing and volunteer for them by going to citizen.org.uk. And it only remains for me to introduce the next speaker in the Citizen series, which will be Dr. Matt Pope from University College London, and he'll be talking about an old view over the Solent, early human archaeology from the coastal plains of Sussex and Hampshire, and that will be in a fortnight's time at 4 o'clock. I think that will be well worth it, so I'll definitely be tuning in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That is just fantastic. I think your depth of knowledge and enthusiasm are both truly inspiring. So thanks a million. And yes, the Citizen team are very much looking forward to being allowed out again. And hopefully we'll be looking at some of these sites. So straight into some questions. We've had quite a few. Okay. And the first one, if that's okay, we'll go through as many as we can. Yep. Someone who is researching the history of exercise smash, and they're not clear where the LCTs launched the tanks, and they're wondering if ship's logs for the LCTs exist, and if so, do you know where they would be?
I would love to find a log for a landing craft tank, and I know that there are a couple of logs in the National Archives, which of course we can't get to right now, but they are very, very few. And it would seem that actually a lot of landing craft didn't even keep logs. The flotilla kept a log instead. And even for those that did, the vast majority appear to have been pulped at the end of the war. Lots and lots of logs from destroyers and anything smaller were disposed of when those ships went out of commission, and they weren't worth retaining. And so motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, destroyers, frigates, and especially landing craft, the vast majority of those just aren't there anymore. To try and find out where exercise smash, which was the, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the DD tank exercise, I think there are operational reports of that exercise. I wouldn't know what their reference number is, but I'm sure that they can probably be found in the National Archives. And I think the people to contact are, is it Bournemouth University that have investigated those tanks? I think it's Bournemouth University, but they might be the people to ask. I can't remember the name, but there is someone. If you message me on Twitter, I'll see if I can find the best person to contact for you.
Sure, we can find out. Great. Another question is, are Citizen recording all of these road improvements and areas of embarkation that you've been showing us? And if not, is there a project to do so?
Citizen are recording sites in the intertidal area, and they have a set number of zones along the coast that they're looking at in detail, and where those have embarkation hards. I'm giving them all the information I have, and they're studying those in great detail. So they're going out and doing survey at Hayling Island and embarkation hards at Stokes Bay and recording those. But their remit is quite limited to, sorry, your remit, I suppose I should say, is limited to specific zones of the coast. So they're not recording all of them, unfortunately. I think really only a handful. And of course, your remit in Citizen is the intertidal area. So no, the road improvements aren't really being recorded as part of that, except where they come right down to the coast. So there is a mass of these road improvements that exist, which aren't recognised as such yet. And I'm slowly starting to catalogue them, but it's very much a spare time indulgence. And no, there isn't any project that I know of that, well, I think I'd know. I'd hope I'd know if there was, but there doesn't seem to be any project that is dedicated to cataloguing all of these D-Day improvements, except on a local level. So Historic England very recently did an archaeological report looking at Stokes Bay and Gosport, and of course they included the embarkation hards in that, but they were looking at all periods of history, from prehistory right up to the modern day. So it wasn't an in-depth study of Stokes Bay, understandably, but at least small aspects of this are caught in reports like that. But no, in terms of a nationwide approach, looking at the entire south coast, there isn't, unfortunately.
So work to be done for sure.
Definitely.
Thank you. Someone else asks if there are the remains of a hard at the entrance to Langstone Harbour on the Eastney side.
No, not that I'm aware of. Certainly it's not recorded in any official correspondence or maps or plans that I have. There are some very interesting structures over at Eastney, and I've looked at them before. It's possible, because you've got Eastney Barracks over there, that they constructed slips for COP, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, because they were operating small boats. But they would probably only be for minor landing craft, and they wouldn't be recognised as hards in the same manner as the ones I've been talking about. So there probably are all sorts of little concrete slips that were constructed in the 1940s just to make it easier to get on a minor landing craft. But there's no official record of one on Langstone Harbour. But again, if you want to message me on Twitter, or even if you're not on Twitter, you can find my homepage on Twitter, and there's a link to my website, and on there's a contact page, so you can get in touch with me by email. I can have a look at which piece of concrete you might be thinking of and see if I can work out what it is.
Great, thank you. And in keeping with the topic of hards, someone is wondering if the term hard is purely World War II term, because in Plymouth there's an admiral's hard, but this person thinks that goes back to a much earlier period, and it's near the Royal William.
Hard is a word that's used around the Solent area as well. Buckler's hard in the New Forest stands out immediately, and certainly those names date back much earlier than World War II, back into probably something like the 15th century. I think it's just an old phrase for a slipway, or a key. No, not a key. A slip, essentially. Yeah. I mean, we would probably just call them slipways today, but hards is just an older name for exactly the same thing. But it was the name that was used in all of the correspondence by the War Office and the Admiralty when they constructed these. They very specifically titled them embarkation hards, and each one was given a code name. So it'd be embarkation hard Q2, embarkation hard PP1, and so forth. But no, I think the word dates back much further.
And again on hards, how many of the hards in Gosport still survive?
So there were 4 built at Stokes Bay. There was a 5th one that was being constructed in Stokes Bay, but was abandoned quite quickly. And I think that goes into Browndown on the west side of Stokes Bay. They did then create a temporary embarkation hard in June 1944 because they had a leftover piece of Mulberry Harbour, which they called GX, although that didn't really involve a huge amount of additional construction. Round in the Portsmouth Harbour area, you have Gosport Hardway, or GH Hard, and that's still there. If you go to Hardway, which is just north of the Explosion Museum, you will find it. It's now Hardway Sailing Club. And it was one of the pictures I showed at the start. All of the chocolate block beach harding mats are still there. And the final one was GF Hard, or Gosport Ferry Hard. And that was built immediately south of the current Gosport Ferry Terminal and just north of the pier for the adjacent marina. And that has been totally removed because the whole waterfront has moved forward about 100 meters in that region, and they've built the tower blocks on top of where the hard actually was, and the waterfront is now moved substantially further east. But yeah, essentially the 4 hards in Stokes Bay, G1 to G4, there are remnants of those still visible. Like I said, the car parks and the beach harding mats in the intertidal area. And further west, you'll find the concrete of the other 2 embarkation hards, G3 and G4. Gosport Hardway still survives, but Gosport Ferry is gone.
Okay, thank you. Now this could be a very lengthy question in a way, but someone is curious about, do you have an idea of the costs of the preparations for D-Day, the infrastructure needed to mount the operations?
No, I'm afraid I don't. There is a lot of paperwork associated with this where costs are established, and it takes a very long time to pull all of that out, and I haven't tried yet. But there are reports on the costs involved, and I know the road improvement networks carried out in April and May 1944, sorry, just in Hampshire alone, I've got the feeling in the back of my head that cost into the tens of thousands of pounds in old money, which is quite a lot, because they needed to purchase land, they needed to buy people's front gardens, they needed to buy the edges of people's fields, and then they needed to carry out the resurfacing work. So it actually cost a lot of money to achieve that, and a lot of people lost front gardens, or in the case of Plymouth, their homes. So yeah, it's more the land purchasing that cost money, and then of course the labour and the materials to build the roads and the embarkation hards. That would have been a phenomenal cost, and like I said, I'm afraid, yeah, I just haven't gone into it yet. It's a whole strand of understanding old money for a start, because I don't really understand old money. I only understand pounds and pence, and shillings and stuff confuse me. But that information is there. It does exist in the historical literature, but I'm afraid I cannot tell you what it was, because I haven't.
No worries, thank you. A few people have seemed just wanting a repeat of a couple of names that you've mentioned, and one of these is, can you repeat the name of the Dutch museum, please?
Yes, that is the Watersnood Museum, and that's the Dutch name. It's water, in the English word, and then just add to it SNOOD, Watersnood. And if you Google Watersnood Museum, you should find it. And if you need any more help, type in Zeeland, which is ZEE land, and you should find it.
Brilliant.
You know, maybe put Dutch Watersnood Museum. So yeah, water, WATERSNOOD.
Thank you. And again, you mentioned a copse at Buckler's Hard. Could you repeat the name of that, please?
That's Clobb's Copse. It's on private land, and yeah, it doesn't make much sense that it's called Clobb's Copse when it's actually a maritime feature. So I presume that's the name of the adjacent copse. But it is on a private estate on the River Beaulieu. You can see it if you sail past there. You can still see some of the metalwork at the entrance to that old oyster bed. And yeah, it's an interesting site. It probably hasn't changed a huge amount, but of course, being a construction site, there's not necessarily going to be a huge amount left in it. But yeah, Clobbs, CLOBBS Copse. But like I said, it's private.
Okay, good to know. Are there any plans? Are there any plans to conserve the D-Day wall near the docks in Southampton that has contemporary graffiti on it?
So that's being studied by the Maritime Archaeology Trust, and they are recording it digitally. I quite often see on Facebook groups and on social media people saying it should be a plastic screen should be put in place to protect it. And that is a very bad idea because that will trap moisture behind the plastic screen and that will then damage the bricks. Well, one of the things I find, because I've looked at some reasonably old photographs of the wall, it's actually still in pretty good condition. The bits that are corroding are not the inscribed bricks. And a lot of people say, oh, we need to protect it from vandalism. And there hasn't been any vandalism of that wall since the Second World War, which I think is remarkable for a start. But you know, it suggests it's not in an area where it's going to suffer from vandalism. So we can't screen it because that will trap moisture in it. I think the only way it could be preserved for the entirety of time would be to dismantle it brick by brick and then re-erect it somewhere else indoors, for instance. But at the same time, I wonder if that's something that we really want to do, because we're removing something from its original location. It's there because, and I quickly will add, it's not a D-Day wall because all of the names date from November 1944, thereabouts. I think the earliest one is August. This is where US troops were lined up on one of those roads I talked about. That was a road that was dedicated to reaching the embarkation hards at Mayflower Park. And these were soldiers who stood there right in front of that wall and scratched their names in it. And I think it would be a shame to move the wall and lose its historical link with its current location. We can't protect it in situ, and so it would be it's a case of either move it or leave it as it is. And as I said, I think it's surviving quite well where it is. But as I said, the Maritime Archaeology Trust are recording it digitally, and if you Google Maritime Archaeology Trust D-Day Wall, you'll find all of that information online. They're doing a great job with it. But as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to actually preserve the wall beyond that.
Thank you. We've still got quite a few questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but please be assured if anyone has sent a question in, then we have a record of it and we will respond. Another one for the moment is, can you please tell me why the mooring points were called dolphins?
I've been asked this before and I don't know. So a dolphin is just a nautical phrase for a standing projection in the water. Around which vessels will maneuver. And you'll find them even today at modern ferry terminals. There will be an outer dolphin that's usually marked on historical charts as a dolphin, around which the vessels will maneuver to get into their berth, and the dolphin becomes a point of securage, so they can secure the vessel alongside the dolphin. That name again seems to predate the Second World War. I can't tell you where it originates from, unfortunately. I genuinely don't know, but it's just a nautical phrase. They called them dolphins, and that's how they're referred to again in the 1940s records. They refer to the construction of dolphins, the repair of dolphins, and so yeah, I just carry on using it. The other, I suppose the typical word we would use would just be a pier, because they're all connected. But when it's a standalone feature, then it's a dolphin. Vague answer,
Thanks.
I know. Sorry.
That's all right. On the Lulworth Avenue site, some of the gardens have concrete walls or runners. Would these have been used to stack the LC prior to putting them in the water?
I don't know. I'm not sure. That certainly seems quite possible. I don't know about those sites. I'd be fascinated to find out more, because it's certainly possible. You do find bits of this stuff recycled all over the place. So the beach hardening mats in particular, I found them deep in the New Forest, where they've been used to shore up fords across streams. And I can only guess that they've been taken from dumps at the end of the war, where these things were stacked up and then just reutilized to repair damage that military vehicles might have done, or just because they were there. And so there is this fascinating aspect of World War II archaeology, of this reuse of military infrastructure. But I don't know the answer to that, because I didn't know about that. So I'd be definitely interested in finding out more. So if the person who asked that question can let me know, that would be great.
Super. And what archaeology is there of pipeline under the ocean? Can you hear me? Hi, Steve. I think you've slightly frozen for me. I'm not sure if others can hear you. We'll call it a day there because the reception is quite poor suddenly for some reason. Apologies.
Yeah, I don't know what that's about. You're suddenly back to normal now. If you want to throw one more question my way, I'm happy to have a go.
Okay, let's do one more. It's just that, yes, it's approaching 7:30, so I think people are probably, they're slowly dropping off, I can see as well. So lastly was a question about the archaeology of pipeline under the ocean, or PLUTO.
Yes.
What archaeology is there?
There's a bit. So Pluto was raised after the war, or as much of it as could be was salvaged. There was an awful lot of infrastructure on the south coast again that still survives today. In particular, over on the Isle of Wight, there are parts of the terminals, both on the north side of the Isle of Wight, where the pipeline crossed from Leap over the Solent to just west of Cowes, and then the infrastructure down at Shanklin, where it was pumped over to France. So there is a lot remaining. It's not one that I study in quite as much detail, but I have found evidence for it. And a project that I ran a few years ago when I worked for Maritime Archaeology Trust called Solent 70 did pick up a fair few bits of Pluto remains. So if you Google Solent 70, you'll find one of my earlier projects on this, which includes some of the embarkation hards, the road improvements, and some of the Pluto stuff as well. So there are bits of it still remaining, both around the Solent and also over at Dungeness, where the second pipeline went across to France. One of the reasons I don't cover it in this talk is because it wasn't actually crucial to D-Day. The second pipeline that went from Dungeness to Boulogne from November 1944 was very successful. The pipeline that went from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg in the summer of 1944 didn't work. So it was a massive engineering feat, but unfortunately the pipeline broke within a few days of its laying, and it never got more than a day's worth of fuel across to Normandy, and so it wasn't actually essential to the war effort. All of that fuel was in fact delivered either by landing craft or tankers that moored offshore of Port-en-Bessin and used a floating oil terminal about a mile offshore, and they pumped their fuel from that floating oil terminal just a mile off the coast onto the shore at Port-en-Bessin. Isn't to say it wasn't a phenomenal technological achievement, but it wasn't actually crucial to D-Day's success.
Thank you, Steve. So I think we'll bring matters to a close there. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
And not at all. And thanks to everyone for joining. Please do take a minute, if you have one, to complete our very short feedback form. It's really valuable to us. And we hope that you can join us again for a slightly earlier period. And our next webinar, we'll be looking at Paleolithic archaeology with, as you can see there, Dr. Matt Pope. And in the meantime, stay safe, everyone. Thanks again, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.